The year the sky closed its fist and refused to open, the town of redemption began to die. It was not a sudden death, not the merciful kind that takes a man in his sleep and leaves him with a peaceful expression for the viewing. No, this was the other kind, the slow kind, the kind that makes you watch every stage of the decay, that forces you to witness the color draining from the world one shade at a time until everything you once knew has turned to dust and bone. The creek bed cracked first. What had been a ribbon of cool, clear water running through the heart of the valley became a mosaic of baked mud, the pattern looking like the palm of an old woman who had worked too hard for too long. The cottonwood trees along its banks dropped their leaves in July, a full 3 months early, as if they knew something the people did not and had decided to surrender before the real suffering began. Then the fields followed. Corn that should have stood tall and green by August withered into yellow stalks that rattled in the hot wind like the bones of small animals. Wheat that should have ripened into gold simply gave up, the heads drooping earthward as if in prayer, though no prayer would save them now. The sun hammered down day after day, relentless and unforgiving, turning the valley floor into an anvil of shimmering heat. Chickens stopped laying. Cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through hides that had once been sleek and healthy. Dogs stopped barking and lay in whatever shade they could find, too exhausted to do anything but pant and wait for relief that never came. One by one, the chimneys of redemption stopped breathing smoke. There was no point in cooking when there was nothing left to cook. No point in heating water when the wells were running dry. No point in any of the small domestic rituals that had once marked the rhythm of daily life in this small Arizona territory town. But high above the valley floor, halfway up the sheer face of Sentinel's Bluff, a single plume of gray smoke continued to rise. It curled upward from what appeared to be solid rock, defying logic and reason, a ghostly finger pointing accusingly at the brass-colored sky. The smoke rose from a place no smoke should be able to rise, from a place where no human being should be able to live. It rose from the home of the Cliff Witch. That was what they called her now. The men gathered around the cold stove in Cornelius Ashford's general store, their bellies empty and their spirits lower, would speak of her in hushed tones mixed with equal parts contempt and confusion. The Cliff Witch, the mad widow, the girl who had gone crazy with grief and started digging her own grave in the side of a mountain. They had laughed at her once, laughed loud and long, slapping their knees and wiping tears of mirth from their eyes. They had made jokes about her at the saloon, had whispered about her after church, had shaken their heads in pity and scorn whenever her name came up in conversation. Now their laughter had dried up along with everything else. Now they watched her smoke rise into the empty sky, and something that felt uncomfortably like fear began to coil in their hungry bellies. Because Lorena Whitfield was still alive up there, still cooking, still surviving, and they were beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the crazy woman had known something they did not. But this story does not begin with drought and desperation. It begins, as so many stories of survival do, with an ending, with a funeral, with a young woman standing alone at the edge of an open grave while the winter wind cut through her black dress like a knife through butter. Lorena Whitfield was 19 years old the day they buried her husband. 19. An age when most young women in redemption were still dreaming of their wedding days, still pressing wildflowers between the pages of books, still believing that life was a gentle river that would carry them safely to some peaceful shore. Lorena had already lived enough life for a woman twice her age, had already loved and lost, had already felt the full weight of the world come crashing down upon her shoulders. Josiah Whitfield had been a carpenter, a good one, the kind of man who could look at a piece of raw timber and see the table or chair or cabinet hidden inside it waiting to be released by skilled hands. He had built half the furniture in redemption, had repaired the church steeple when the spring storms knocked it crooks, had been working on the new schoolhouse addition when the scaffolding gave way. He fell 30 feet onto frozen ground. The doctor said he probably did not feel much pain. The doctor said a lot of things that were meant to be comforting, but somehow only made everything worse. Lorena stood at the graveside and felt the eyes of the entire town upon her. She could sense their pity radiating outward like heat from a stove, thick and suffocating. She could hear the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she turned her head. Poor thing. So young. What will she do now? The minister spoke words that were supposed to bring comfort. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The promise of resurrection and eternal life. But Lorena barely heard any of it. She was too busy feeling the strange sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, of the entire world tilting on its axis and dumping her into some new and terrifying landscape she did not recognize. Josiah was gone. The man who had taught her how to read the grain of wood, who had shown her the difference between a load-bearing wall and a decorative one, who had held her close on cold nights and made her believe that the future was something to look forward to rather than fear. Gone, just like that. One moment he was alive, full of plans and dreams, and the quiet confidence of a craftsman who knew his trade. The next moment, he was a body being lowered into a hole in the frozen earth. After the funeral, the condolences came in waves. Mrs. Orley Kincaid, wife of one of the more prosperous farmers in the valley, approached with tears glistening in her eyes and a casserole dish in her hands. She spoke of how sorry she was, how tragic it all was, how Lorena should not hesitate to ask if she needed anything at all. Then she mentioned almost as an afterthought that she had a spare room and could always use help with the laundry and the mending. Nothing too strenuous, of course, just light work to keep Lorena's hands busy and her mind occupied during this difficult time. The Reverend Josiah Meacham came next, his face arranged in an expression of professional sympathy that he had no doubt practiced in the mirror many times over his years of ministry. He spoke of God's mysterious ways of finding strength in faith, of the importance of community in times of trial. Then he mentioned that his unmarried sister lived alone in a cottage at the edge of town and could use a companion. Someone to help with cooking and cleaning and to provide company during the long winter evenings. Others followed. The banker's wife, who suggested Lorena might find work as a seamstress. The school teacher, who thought she might make a passable assistant. The owner of the boarding house, who had a small room in the attic that he could let at a reduced rate in exchange for help in the kitchen. They were kind in their way, these offers. Lorena understood that. They came from a genuine desire to help, from the same impulse that makes people bring food to funerals and speak in hushed, reverent tones around the grieving. But kindness can be a cage. Compassion can become a set of chains. And every offer that was made to Lorena Whitfield came with invisible strings, attached conditions that would slowly but surely reshape her into something she did not want to become. A servant, a companion, an object of pity to be managed and contained and kept safely within the boundaries of what the good people of redemption considered acceptable for a young widow. They wanted to smooth her edges, to fit her back into a shape they could understand, to transform her grief into something productive and contain something that would not make them uncomfortable or force them to confront the randomness and cruelty of a universe that could kill a young carpenter in the prime of his life. Lorena looked at each offer with clear eyes and saw exactly what it was. A closing door disguised as an open one. She refused them all. The night after the funeral, Lorena sat alone in the small house that Josiah had built with his own hands. The house that still smelled like sawdust and wood shavings, that still held the imprint of his presence in every beam and board. She sat at the kitchen table with a single candle burning its flame, casting dancing shadows on walls that suddenly seemed too close, too confining, too full of memories that cut like broken glass. On the table before her lay a stack of papers, bills, debts, the accumulated obligations that came with building a life and then having that life abruptly ended. $200 owed to Cornelius Ashford for lumber and supplies. The materials Josiah had purchased on credit for jobs he would now never complete. Ashford had been at the funeral, had offered his condolences with a face full of practiced sorrow, had mentioned almost casually that he hoped the debt would not be too much of a burden during this difficult time. Lorena had seen the calculation in his eyes. The quick mental arithmetic of a merchant assessing a risky investment. She knew what he was thinking. A widow with no income and a house full of furniture would have to sell something eventually, and when she did, he would be first in line to collect what was owed. But beneath the bills and the debts, there was something else. Something Lorena had almost forgotten existed until she began sorting through the papers that had accumulated in the desk Josiah used for his business affairs. A deed. Old and yellowed, the paper crinkled with age, the ink faded to a pale brown that was barely readable in the candlelight. A deed to property that had belonged to her grandfather, Ezekiel Pardo. Lorena's mother had rarely spoken of her father. He had been a strange man, people said, a geologist and naturalist in a town full of farmers and merchants. A man who saw the world in layers and timelines that ordinary people could not comprehend, who spent his days studying rocks and fossils, while his neighbors focused on the practical business of survival. He had died when Lorena was 12, leaving behind nothing but his books and this single piece of paper. A deed to property in redemption. 1 acre, but not 1 acre of farmland or pasture or any other useful ground. 1 vertical acre of Sentinel's Bluff, a sheer cliff face that rose 500 feet above the valley floor, a massive wall of sandstone that had always marked the western boundary of the town's world. To anyone else, it was worthless. A joke. The kind of inheritance that made people shake their heads and mutter about how some folks were touched in the head, and what did you expect from a man who spent his life talking to rocks? But Lorena remembered her grandfather, remembered sitting on his knee as a little girl while he turned the pages of his heavy books and pointed to drawings of strange dwellings carved into cliffsides far away in places called Mesa Verde and Bandelier. Remembered his voice patient and warm, explaining how ancient peoples had understood something that modern folks had forgotten. The earth remembers everything, he would say, his finger tracing the outline of a fossil embedded in a piece of shale. It remembers where the water flows, where the wind scours, where the sun is kind. People forget. The earth remembers. She remembered him taking her to the base of Sentinel's Bluff when she was 10 years old, showing her how to read the layers of rock like pages in a book. This layer here, he had said, pointing to a band of darker stone, this is where an ancient sea once lapped against a shore that no longer exists. And this one higher up, this is where a river carved its path 1,000,000 years before any human walked this land. He had taught her to see the cliff not as a barrier, but as a story, not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. And now sitting alone in her dead husband's house with creditors circling like vultures, in a town full of well-meaning people trying to fit her into a box she had no intention of occupying, Lorena Whitfield looked at that worthless piece of paper and saw something that no one else in Redemption could see. She saw a way out. The next morning she began. Lorena sold the house, sold the furniture that Josiah had crafted with such care and skill, sold the wedding china that had belonged to his mother, sold everything that could be converted to cash keeping, only their clothes, Josiah's tools, and her grandfather's books. $700. It was a fortune by the standards of Redemption. More money than most families saw in a year of hard work. The kind of sum that could set a young widow up comfortably if she invested it wisely, put it in the bank, lived frugally, and found respectable work. The town watched and whispered, "She is selling everything, even the furniture he built with his own hands, even the bed where they spent their wedding night." Has she no shame? But the whispers turned to gasps of disbelief when they learned what Lorena intended to do with the money. First, she paid off the debt to Cornelius Ashford. $200 counted out in bills and coins on the counter of his general store, while he stared at her with an expression that shifted from surprise to confusion to something that looked almost like disappointment. He had been counting on that debt, planning to use it as leverage. The sudden elimination of his hold over her left him off balance, uncertain how to respond. "Thank you kindly," he managed to say, sweeping the money into his cash drawer. "I hope this settles matters between us." "It does," Lorena replied. And the flatness in her voice made it clear that the settling went both ways. Then she spent what remained. She bought a mule, a sturdy, bad-tempered creature with ears like sails and a disposition that suggested it had given up on humanity long ago. She bought dynamite, enough to blow a hole in a mountain, which was exactly what she intended to do. She bought steel drills and a sledgehammer, two pickaxes and a wheelbarrow, rope and pulleys and canvas tarps, flour and salt pork, and dried beans enough to feed two people for 6 months if they were careful. The shopkeepers took her money with expressions of barely concealed bewilderment. The blacksmith, when she commissioned extra strong drill bits and chisel heads, looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "What in God's name do you need all this for?" he asked. "I am going to build a house," Lorena replied. A house where she pointed toward the cliff that loomed over the western edge of town, its face catching the morning sun and glowing like burnished copper. There, the blacksmith looked at the cliff, looked at the slight young woman standing before him, looked back at the cliff again. Then he shook his head, slowly took her money, and began to wonder if the grief had finally broken something inside her mind. The whole town wondered the same thing. Lorena's brother Emmett was 17 years old, a boy caught in that awkward space between childhood and manhood, where everything seemed uncertain and the future was a fog that refused to lift. He had lost his father to fever when he was 12, lost his mother to heartbreak a year later, had been living with Lorena and Josiah for the past 2 years, helping with the odd jobs, trying to find his place in a world that seemed determined to knock him down every time he tried to stand. Now Josiah was gone too, and Emmett found himself wondering if loss was simply the natural state of things, if everyone he loved was destined to leave him one way or another. He found his sister loading the wagon in front of the now empty house. The mule stood in its traces regarding the proceedings with an expression of profound skepticism. "What are you doing?" Emmett asked, though he could see perfectly well what she was doing. "Loading the wagon, I can see that." "Where are we going?" Lorena paused in her work and looked at her brother. Really looked at him the way she used to look at pieces of wood when she was helping Josiah assess their quality. "We are going home," she said. Emmett looked around at the house he had lived in for 2 years, the house they were apparently abandoning. "This is home," he said. "No," Lorena's voice was firm. "This was a place to stay. Home is something different. Home is something you build yourself, something that cannot be taken from you." She gestured toward the cliff that dominated the western horizon. "We are going there." Emmett felt something cold settle into his stomach. He had heard the whispers around town, knew what people were saying about his sister, about her grief-stricken madness, about the inheritance that everyone considered worthless. "They think you have lost your mind," he said, not as an accusation, but as a worried fact. Lorena climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. She looked not at her brother, but at the cliff face gleaming in the morning sun, at the bands of red and gold and brown that marked millions of years of geological history. "Let them," she said. "The stone does not care what they think." Emmett stood for a long moment looking back at the town that had been his home, such as it was, looking at the familiar streets and houses and faces that were already turning away from them, already dismissing them as lost causes. Then he climbed up beside his sister, and together they headed not west toward new horizons, not east toward civilization, but straight toward the unyielding stone wall that had always marked the edge of their world. Behind them, the town of redemption watched them go. "Good riddance," Cornelius Ashford said to the men gathered on the porch of his store. "That girl was always strange. Her grandfather filled her head with nonsense, and now grief has finished the job. Mark my words, she will be back within a month begging for help, and I, for one, will not be quick to offer it." The men nodded and murmured their agreement. None of them noticed the way the morning light fell on the cliff face, picking out patterns and shadows that seemed almost deliberate. None of them saw the faint markings carved into the rock at a spot about halfway up, markings that had been there for 15 years waiting for someone who knew how to read them. None of them understood that they were watching not a tragedy in progress, but the first chapter of something remarkable. The first strike of the pickaxe against sandstone echoed across the silent valley like a declaration of war. The sound was sharp and angry, a crack of metal against stone that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the vast emptiness. Then it was gone, and there was only Lorena Whitfield, her slight frame outlined against the massive wall of rock and the shudder that ran up the hickory handle into her arms. She had chosen her spot carefully. Not randomly, not based on convenience or guesswork, but through careful study of the cliff face using methods her grandfather had taught her years ago. There, about 40 feet up the cliff, a natural ledge jutted out from the rock face wide enough to provide a foundation. Above it, the sandstone was a particular shade of reddish-brown that indicated a softer composition easier to work than the iron-rich bands that ran through other parts of the bluff. And most importantly, her grandfather's books showed a symbol carved into the rock nearby, a simple mark that only someone who knew his system would recognize. The mark indicated water. Somewhere behind that wall of stone, if Ezekiel Pardo's research was correct, there was moisture. Maybe a seep, maybe a trickle, maybe a full underground spring fed by snow melt from distant mountains. Regardless of the volume, it represented something invaluable, a source of water that did not depend on rain or wells or the fickle generosity of the sky. Getting up to the ledge had been the first challenge. Lorena and Emmett had spent 3 days constructing a crude scaffolding system using rope and timber and sheer determination to create a pathway up the cliff face. It was dangerous work, the kind that would have made Josiah nervous if he had been there to see it. But Josiah had taught her well. She understood load and stress, knew how to anchor a rope to bear weight, could calculate the strength of a beam just by looking at its grain and thickness. The scaffolding held. Now she stood on the ledge with her pickaxe raised, looking at the wall of stone before her. A wall that had stood unchanged for millions of years, that had watched dinosaurs walk and ice ages come and go, that had never yielded to anything except the slow, patient work of wind and water. She was about to become something new in its long history. She was about to make it yield to human will. The second strike came harder than the first, then the third. Then a rhythm began to establish itself, the steady percussion of metal on stone that would become the soundtrack of her life for the next 6 months. Emmett worked beside her when the space allowed, clearing away the rubble she produced, carrying it to the edge of the ledge and letting it fall to the valley floor below. The debris accumulated in a growing pile at the base of the cliff, a pyramid of broken stone that marked their progress. Progress. That was a generous word for what they accomplished in those first weeks. Each day began before sunrise. They would eat a cold breakfast of biscuits and dried meat, then climb the scaffolding to the ledge and begin their work. Lorena would swing the pickaxe until her arms burned and her hands screamed for relief. Then Emmett would take over while she rested, and she would use the time to study her grandfather's books by the light of the rising sun. The books were her guides, her teachers, her connection to a man who had died years ago, but had somehow anticipated this moment, had somehow known that his strange granddaughter would one day need to understand the secrets he had spent his life uncovering. There were diagrams of Roman aqueducts showing how ancient engineers had moved water through mountains using nothing but gravity and stone. There were sketches of the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, detailed drawings that showed how the ancestral Puebloans had carved homes into sandstone walls and lived there for generations. There were notes in her grandfather's cramped handwriting, observations about the geology of Sentinel's Bluff that read like a roadmap for anyone who knew how to interpret them. The earth remembers everything he had written in one margin. It remembers where the water flows, where the wind scours, where the sun is kind. Learn to read these memories and you will never be truly lost. Lorena read these words again and again, letting them sink into her bones, letting them become part of the rhythm that drove her forward with each swing of the pickaxe. Her hands were the first part of her body to transform. Within a week, the soft palms of a young widow had become landscapes of blisters. Great fluid-filled domes rose on her skin, turned an angry red. then burst and bled and stung with a pain that made her eyes water. She wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept working. The blisters gave way to raw, weeping wounds, then slowly to calluses. Layer upon layer of hardened skin built up nature's own gloves until her hands were as tough as old leather and could grip a pickaxe handle for hours without complaint. Her arms followed a similar transformation. Muscles that had been adequate for household tasks developed new strength, new definition. Her shoulders broadened almost imperceptibly. Her back, though it ached terribly at the end of each day, learned to bear the constant strain. Lorena was carving herself into something new just as she was carving a home from the rock. The soft edges were being worn away, replaced by something harder, more durable, more suited to the task at hand. But the physical transformation was only part of it. There was also the matter of the mind. Working in silence for hours at a time with only the rhythm of the pickaxe and the vast indifference of the rock for company, Lorena found herself entering states of consciousness she had never experienced before. Meditative states almost where the boundary between herself and the work seemed to dissolve. She would lose track of time, lose track of everything except the feel of the tool in her hands, the resistance of the stone, the small victories when a chunk of rock broke free and revealed the space that had been hidden within it. She began to understand what her grandfather had meant when he spoke of reading the stone. It was not just a matter of identifying different types of rock or understanding geological formations. It was about developing a relationship with the material, learning its personality, discovering its secrets. Some sections of the cliff were stubborn, resistant, determined to maintain their integrity. These required patience and precision, careful strikes that exploited natural weaknesses in the structure. Other sections were eager to yield, almost cooperative, as if they had been waiting for someone to release them from their stony prison. The cliff, she realized, was not uniform. It was a community of different stones, different textures, different stories, all compressed together over millions of years into something that only looked solid and unchanging from a distance. Up close with her hands and her tools and her attention focused on every square inch, it became infinitely complex, infinitely interesting, infinitely alive in its own slow geological way. And then about 3 weeks into the work, Lorena found the first of her grandfather's marks. It was hidden in a shallow depression in the rock, protected from weather and wear, as clear and sharp as the day he had carved it 15 years ago. A simple symbol, a circle with a line through it that might have meant nothing to anyone who stumbled upon it by accident. But Lorena knew what it meant. She had seen it in his books, in the margins of his notes. It was his sign for soft rock. It meant that the stone behind this mark would yield more easily than the surrounding material. Her heart began to pound as she attacked the spot with renewed energy. And sure enough, within an hour, she had broken through into a pocket of much softer material, almost like packed sand compared to the dense sandstone that surrounded it. She followed the soft pocket deeper into the cliff, her excitement growing with each swing. Her grandfather had known, had somehow predicted that she would be here doing exactly this, and had left markers to guide her way. That night, she spread his books out on the ledge and searched through them by lantern light while Emmett slept. And she found what she was looking for, a rough map of Sentinel's Bluff drawn in her grandfather's hand, showing the locations of soft pockets, underground seeps, and structural weaknesses that could be exploited by a determined excavator. He had done this for her. Somehow, impossibly, he had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. The earth remembers, his voice seemed to whisper in her mind, and I have helped it remember the things you will need to know. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the ledge and watched the stars wheel overhead and felt something she had not felt since Josiah's death. Hope. From the valley below, the work was almost invisible. The cliff was so massive, so overwhelming in scale, that the tiny figures chipping away at its face seemed as insignificant as insects. But insects, given enough time, can hollow out a tree, can reduce a house to dust, can transform the solid into the empty through nothing but persistence. And persistence was something Lorena Whitfield had in abundance. After 2 months, the initial cavity had grown into something that could reasonably be called a room. It was rough-hewn and unfinished, smelling of damp stone and raw effort, but it was shelter. It was real. It was progress measured not in inches, but in feet. 20 feet deep, 10 feet wide, 8 feet high. Enough space for two people to live if those two people were willing to accept close quarters and minimal comfort. Enough space to get out of the wind and rain, to light a fire and cook a meal, to sleep on a level surface instead of balanced precariously on a cliff ledge. The fire, though, that was the challenge. A fire in a cave could be a death sentence. The smoke would have nowhere to go except into the lungs of whoever was foolish enough to light it. She had seen her grandfather's notes on the subject, had studied diagrams of how ancient peoples had solved this problem. The key was the chimney, but not just any chimney. Not a straight vertical shaft that would be almost impossible to carve through solid rock. No, the solution was more elegant than that. Lorena spent days examining the interior of her carved space, searching for natural fissures in the rock cracks and seams that ran upward toward the cliff face. She found what she was looking for in the rear corner of the room, a natural fracture that angled sharply upward and to the right, following a weakness in the sandstone. She spent another week working on that crack, widening it, smoothing it, following its natural path through the rock until it emerged on the cliff face a good 15 feet above the entrance to her home. The day she finished, she built a small fire in the corner of the room and held her breath. Emmett stood beside her, equally tense. They watched the smoke rise from the flames, watched it swirl and eddy in the still air of the enclosed space. For a terrible moment, it seemed like the smoke was going nowhere. It hung in a growing cloud near the ceiling, thick and choking, and Lorena felt her heart sink. Then something shifted, some quirk of air pressure, some subtle change in the atmosphere. The smoke hesitated, seemed to make a decision, and then streamed upward into the chimney flue, as if summoned by an invisible hand. A perfect draw. Lorena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Beside her, Emmett began to laugh. Not the bitter, despairing laughter of a young man who had lost too much, but the genuine, joyful laughter of someone who has just witnessed a small miracle. They had warmth. They had a hearth. They had a home. Down in the valley, the people of Redemption saw the smoke rising from the cliff face and did not know what to make of it. How is that possible, they asked each other. How can there be a chimney in solid rock? The questions were tinged with unease. It was one thing to laugh at a grief-stricken widow scratching at a cliff with a pickaxe. It was another thing entirely to see evidence that her scratching was producing actual results. Cornelius Ashford, who had been the loudest voice in the chorus of mockery, found himself growing quieter as the weeks went by. He still made his jokes, still referred to her as the Cliff Witch, and predicted her imminent failure. But his words lacked the conviction they had once held. Because every morning when the sun rose over Redemption, that plume of smoke was still there, still rising from the cliff face, still defying everything he thought he understood about the world. The children of the town were the first to give voice to the unease that the adults were reluctant to acknowledge. They would gather at the base of the bluff in the late afternoon when the shadows were long and the cliff face took on an ominous appearance. They would dare each other to get close, to shout insults and names to prove their courage before scurrying back to the safety of the valley. Cliff Witch, they would yell, their voices thin and sharp in the vast emptiness. Cliff Witch, then they would run, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting something terrible to come swooping down from the heights in pursuit. Lorena heard them. From her home in the rock, their voices carried clearly, each taunt and jeer distinct and cutting. She never stopped working. She never responded. She simply swung her pickaxe and let the rhythm of the work drown out the sound of their cruelty. The isolation was a physical presence, as real as the rock dust that coated her skin and hair. Lorena had always been somewhat solitary by nature. Even as a child, she had preferred the company of her grandfather's books to the chatter of other children. Even as a young wife, she had found her deepest satisfaction in quiet moments of work and creation, rather than in social gatherings and gossip. But this was different. This was isolation imposed from without a quarantine, enforced by the judgment of an entire community. She was a ghost in her own life, visible, but not acknowledged, present, but not included. When Emmett went down to the valley to purchase supplies, conversations would stop as he entered the general store. Eyes would follow him, full of pity and suspicion. Cornelius Ashford would take his money readily enough, but the transaction would be accompanied by pointed comments and knowing looks. "How is your sister?" Ashford would ask, his voice dripping with false concern. "Still up there scratching at that rock. Still playing at being a pioneer." Emmett would take his supplies and leave without responding. But the weight of the encounter showed in his face when he returned to the cliff, in the slump of his shoulders, in the tightness around his eyes. He was young. The need to belong, to be accepted, to be seen as normal, was a powerful current in his blood. And every trip to the valley reminded him that he had cast his lot with someone the world considered mad. It came to a breaking point one evening in early spring. Emmett climbed up to the ledge after a supply run, his movements jerky and aggressive. He threw a small bag of nails onto the ground with unnecessary force, and the clatter of metal on stone echoed off the walls of their carved home. "They are laughing at us," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "They laugh every time I go down there. Ashford asked if we were building our own asylum. He said it to my face." Lorena stopped her work and turned to face him. She was covered in rock dust, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her hands red and raw despite the calluses. But her eyes were clear and calm, as still and deep as mountain pools. "Do you believe him?" she asked quietly. Emmett hesitated. His anger wanted to answer one way. His heart, which had seen what his sister was accomplishing against impossible odds, wanted to answer another. "I do not know what to believe anymore," he admitted. "This is insane, Lorena. We are breaking our backs, digging a hole while everyone else is living a normal life down there." Lorena leaned on her sledgehammer and let the silence stretch between them. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Their normal is built on top of the dirt. They are vulnerable to wind, to fire, to drought. They trust the sky to be kind. Grandfather taught me to trust the earth. The earth is honest." She gestured toward the valley, with her chin toward the distant houses and barns that looked so small and fragile from this height. "Now, do you believe in the earth, or do you believe in Cornelius Ashford's good opinion?" Emmett stood motionless for a long moment. His eyes moved from his sister's face to the solid, growing shape of the room they had carved together. Then they moved down to the town, which suddenly seemed flimsy and insubstantial compared to the mountain beneath his feet. He bent down and picked up the bag of nails he had thrown. "The earth," he said. His voice was solid for the first time in weeks. "I believe in the earth." From that day forward, he met the town's scorn with a stony silence that was in its own way as defiant as his sister's relentless digging. He stopped trying to explain or justify. He stopped caring what Cornelius Ashford or anyone else thought. He became a Whitfield in truth, as well as name carved from the same stubborn stone as his sister. Progress continued. Slow but inexorable, like the movement of glaciers or the growth of stalactites. Each day brought new challenges, new discoveries, new reasons to keep going. Lorena worked on the interior of their home with tools that Josiah had taught her to use. She smoothed the walls where they were rough, left them textured where texture would be useful. She carved niches into the stone for storage, shaped a raised platform that would serve as a sleeping area, created a depression in the floor near the fire pit that would hold water for washing. Following her grandfather's diagrams, she left a central pillar of solid rock in the middle of the room for structural support. The weight of the mountain above them was immense, and without that pillar, there was a risk that their ceiling would collapse. She thought about Josiah often as she worked, thought about the way he would approach a problem, the careful way he would assess a piece of wood before making his first cut. She could almost hear his voice in her head, sometimes offering advice and encouragement. Mind the grain, Lorena. Let the material tell you what it wants to be. She was not sure if she was going mad or if she had simply internalized his lessons so thoroughly that his voice had become part of her own thinking. Either way, she found comfort in it. The rubble from her excavation was not waste. It was material. Following her grandfather's sketches, she and Emmett used the broken stone to build retaining walls at the base of the cliff, creating the first of what would eventually become several terraces. They filled the spaces behind the walls with soil hauled up from the valley floor in buckets, creating narrow strips of flat, plantable land on the side of a vertical mountain. Gravity, her grandfather had written in one of his notebooks, can be a patient friend or a sudden enemy. She chose to make it her friend, using the weight of the rock to anchor their future gardens to the side of the cliff. It was back-breaking work, the kind of work that would have seemed impossible if Lorena had allowed herself to think about the full scope of what she was attempting. But she had learned not to think in those terms. She had learned to focus on the task immediately in front of her, to measure progress in inches rather than miles. One stone at a time. That was how mountains were moved. Then on an afternoon in late spring, a visitor appeared at the base of the cliff. Lorena saw him from above, a broad-shouldered figure picking his way through the rubble pile toward the scaffolding that led up to their ledge. For a moment, her heart clenched with fear. Was this someone coming to cause trouble? Someone sent by Ashford to intimidate or threaten? But as the figure drew closer, she recognized him. Gideon Falk, the town blacksmith, a quiet man who spoke little and observed much, who had been retempering their drill bits and pickaxe heads for months without comment or judgment. He climbed the scaffolding with careful deliberation, testing each handhold and foothold before committing his weight. When he reached the ledge, he stood for a moment in silence, his eyes taking in everything Lorena and Emmett had accomplished. The room carved into the cliff, the chimney venting smoke into the sky, the beginnings of the terrace walls below. The organized workspace with tools hanging from pegs driven into cracks in the rock. He walked the perimeter of their home without asking permission, his experienced eye assessing the construction in a way that made Lorena nervous. What if he found some fatal flaw, some mistake that would bring everything crashing down? Finally, he ran a hand over the smooth interior wall, feeling the texture of the work stone. You read the grain of the rock, he said. It was more observation than compliment, stated with the matter-of-fact tone of one craftsman acknowledging the skill of another. Lorena felt something loosen in her chest. She had not realized how much she needed someone, anyone, to see her work for what it was, rather than dismiss it as madness. My grandfather taught me, she said simply. He would be proud, Gideon replied. He turned to look at her directly, his weathered face serious but not unkind. You are burning through steel at a remarkable rate. Those drill bits and pickaxe heads are not made for the kind of sustained work you are putting them through. I know, Lorena said. She felt a flicker of worry. The cost of replacement tools was a constant drain on her dwindling resources. I have been doing my best to maintain them, but the rock is hard. Gideon nodded. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind, making a decision. I can forge you a set with a harder edge. Special steel tempered differently. It will cost you, but it will cut your work in half. How much? Lorena braced herself. She knew how expensive quality steel was. She knew that the $43 she had left was not enough to cover the kind of tools Gideon was describing. What do you have? He asked. $43. Gideon was silent for a long moment. Then a ghost of a smile crossed his face there and gone so quickly that Lorena almost missed it. The steel is worth more than that, he said, but I will take the 43. Consider the rest an investment in a fascinating project. Lorena stared at him, unable to quite believe what she was hearing. An investment from someone who had no reason to believe in her, no stake in her success. Why, she asked. The question came out more bluntly than she intended, but she was too surprised to soften it. Gideon looked around at the carved walls, the clever chimney, the evidence of months of intelligent, determined work. Because I have never seen anyone read stone the way you do, he said. And because Cornelius Ashford has been predicting your failure since the day you started, that alone makes me want to see you succeed. He extended his hand, and Lorena shook it. His grip was firm and callous, the hand of a man who worked with fire and metal for a living. I will have the new tools ready in a week, he said. And if you ever need anything repaired or sharpened, you know where to find me. Then he climbed back down the scaffolding and walked away through the rubble pile, leaving Lorena standing on her ledge with the sunset painting the cliff face gold and red around her. It was the first time anyone from Redemption had looked at her work and seen something worth believing in. It would not be the last. The new tools arrived exactly when Gideon had promised, and they changed everything. The steel was different. Lorena could feel it from the first strike. Harder, yes, but also more precisely balanced. The pickaxe bit into the rock and held its edge. The drill bits chewed through sandstone that had resisted all her previous efforts. Work that had taken hours now took minutes. Progress that had been measured in inches began to be measured in feet. With Gideon's tools, Lorena and Emmett began the second phase of their excavation. A smaller cavern deeper into the cliff, connected to the main room by a narrow passageway. This would be their cold store, a place to preserve food when the time came. The temperature deep inside the mountain was constant cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. Meat and vegetables stored here would last for months. And beyond the cold store, Lorena began work on something even more ambitious. A narrow shaft angled upward through the rock, following natural fissures and weaknesses, working toward the top of the bluff. It was the most dangerous work she had attempted. Carving upward meant constant danger from falling debris from unstable rock, from the ever-present risk of a collapse that would bury her alive in the heart of the mountain. But when it was finished, they would have a second access point to their home, a way to reach the cliff top without using the external scaffolding, which was vulnerable to weather and could be destroyed by enemies if enemies ever came. More importantly, the cliff top would give them access to land. Land for gardens, for animals, for the expansion that Lorena could already see in her mind's eye, even if no one else could imagine it yet. The seasons turned. Spring gave way to summer, then to autumn. The leaves in the valley below changed color and fell, and the nights grew cold, and the first frost silvered the ground in the mornings. Inside their cliff home, Lorena and Emmett were warm. The massive walls of stone absorbed heat from their fire during the day and radiated it back at night. While the people of Redemption huddled around their stoves, burning precious wood to keep the winter chill at bay, the Whitfields slept comfortably in their mountain fortress, protected by the thermal mass of the earth itself. Lorena thought of her grandfather often during those long winter evenings. Thought of him sitting in his study, surrounded by his books and specimens, trying to explain to anyone who would listen that the old ways of building, the ways that worked with the earth instead of against it, had wisdom that modern construction had forgotten. No one had listened then. They were too busy putting up their clapboard houses, too confident in their ability to impose human will on the landscape without consequence. But Lorena had listened. And now, as the wind howled across the valley and found no purchase on her stone walls, she understood exactly what her grandfather had been trying to teach her. The earth remembers, and if you are wise enough to listen, it will share its secrets with you. By the end of that first winter, the cliff home was essentially complete. 2 rooms carved from living rock connected by a passageway and ventilated by a clever chimney system. A cold store that kept food fresh for months. A vertical shaft that emerged on the cliff top, giving them access to the land above. From the valley on clear days, you could see the entrance to their home as a dark rectangle set into the cliff face. You could see the smoke rising from their chimney proof of warmth and life, in a place where no warmth or life should be possible. The people of Redemption had stopped laughing. They had not yet started to understand, but understanding was coming. It was coming with the spring, with the brass-colored sky, and the absent rain, with the slow, terrible death that was even now beginning to creep across the land. And when it came, everything would change. The plume of smoke rising from Sentinel's Bluff became a fixture of the Redemption skyline. as fixed and reliable as the cliff itself, as much a part of the daily landscape as the church steeple or the water tower. People stopped remarking on it, stopped wondering about it, stopped speculating about how long before the widow gave up and came crawling back to civilization. She had outlasted their predictions, outlasted their mockery, outlasted everything they had expected of her. And high above them in her home of carved stone, Lorena Whitfield sat with her grandfather's books spread before her and read about the coming storm, about cycles of drought that swept across the land every few decades, about ancient peoples who had learned to prepare for lean years during times of plenty, about the terrible price that civilizations paid when they forgot the lessons of the past. 7 fat years her grandfather had written, quoting sources far older than himself. 7 lean years. People have short memories. They build their lives for the fat years and curse their luck in the lean ones. Preparation is just a form of remembering. Lorena looked out at the valley below, at the fields and farms and houses that all depended on rain that fell from the sky and wells that drew from underground water. She looked at the complacent prosperity of a town that had known nothing but fat years for as long as anyone could remember, and she began to prepare for what she knew was coming. The town of redemption did not know it yet, would not believe it if she told them, would laugh and dismiss her warnings just as they had laughed and dismissed everything else about her. But the earth remembered. The rocks and the soil and the underground streams remembered patterns that human beings had forgotten. And Lorena Whitfield, who had learned to read the memories of the earth, remembered too. Spring arrived in the Valley of Redemption with all the usual fanfare. Wildflowers pushed through the softening earth. Birds returned from their winter migrations and filled the mornings with song. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed unfurled their leaves in pale green profusion. But Lorena Whitfield, watching from her perch on Sentinel's Bluff, noticed something that the people in the valley did not. The creek was running low, not dramatically low, not obviously low, just a few inches beneath where it should have been at this time of year, when snow melt from the distant mountains should have been swelling its banks. The kind of difference that most people would dismiss as natural variation, as nothing to worry about. Lorena worried. She had spent the winter studying her grandfather's books with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Page after page of observations and calculations of weather patterns and geological records of evidence painstakingly gathered over decades of careful study. Ezekiel Pardo had been watching the signs for years before his death, had seen the subtle shifts in rainfall patterns, the gradual lowering of the water table, the stress marks appearing in trees that should have been thriving. He had tried to warn people, had written letters to the territorial government, and published articles in scientific journals that nobody in Redemption bothered to read. Nobody had listened. And now his granddaughter sat in the home she had carved from his worthless inheritance and read his warnings with the clarity of hindsight. The drought is coming, he had written in one of his final notebooks. Not this year, perhaps, or even the next, but soon. The signs are unmistakable for anyone who knows how to read them. The land is drying out from beneath like a sponge being slowly squeezed. When the surface moisture finally fails, when the rains do not come, the damage will be catastrophic. He had included calculations, estimates of how long the underground water reserves could sustain the valley, predictions of crop failures and well shortages, a timeline of suffering that read like a prophecy of doom. Lorena closed the notebook and looked out at the valley below, where farmers were plowing their fields and planting their seeds with the same confidence they showed every spring. They had no idea what was coming, and she knew with a certainty that sat cold and heavy in her stomach that they would not believe her if she tried to tell them. So she did not try. Instead, she prepared. The terraces Lorena and Emmett had built during the first year of their work were ready for planting. Narrow strips of level ground carved from the mountainside, held in place by walls of stacked stone filled with soil that they had hauled up from the valley floor bucket by excruciating bucket. It had taken months, Months of back-breaking labor of endless trips up and down the cliff face of muscles screaming for rest that never came. Emmett had devised a pulley system to make the work easier, a simple but effective winch anchored to a sturdy juniper tree at the top of the bluff. But even with the mechanical advantage, it remained grueling work. The soil was precious. Each bucketful represented hours of effort, and Lorena treated it accordingly. She mixed it with composted goat manure and decomposed leaves, enriching it with nutrients that would help plants thrive in this unlikely location. Then she planted what her grandfather had called the survivors, potatoes that grew deep beneath the soil, protected from heat and cold alike. Kale that laughed at frost and could be harvested well into winter. Climbing beans that would use the cliff face itself as a trellis, reaching upward toward the sun with determined tendrils. These were not delicate crops, not the temperamental vegetables that required perfect conditions and constant attention. These were the plants that had sustained frontier families through hard times, that could survive neglect and abuse and still produce food. Survivors, like her. She also planted an orchard of sorts, apple seedlings and peach pits tucked into pockets of soil on the wider upper terrace. They would take years to bear fruit, but Lorena was thinking in years now, thinking in decades, building something that would last long after the current crisis had passed. While she worked the soil, Emmett focused on the animals. They had acquired livestock gradually over the preceding months. Two pregnant goats purchased from a farmer who thought he was cheating the crazy cliff woman by selling her his most troublesome animals. A dozen chickens that clucked and fussed and settled into their new home with surprising ease. Getting them up to the cliff top had been an adventure. The goats went up in a specially constructed crate hauled by the winch, while they bleated their displeasure at this indignity. The chickens were carried up in baskets, their wings bound to prevent them from escaping during the ascent. By the time they reached the top, Emmett was covered in scratches and pecking wounds, but the job was done. The crowning achievement was Daisy, a young milk cow barely more than a calf purchased from a widow in the next valley who could no longer afford to feed her. Getting Daisy up the cliff face required a different approach entirely. The winch could handle goats and chickens, but a cow was another matter. Lorena spent a month carving a wider, gentler path up the backside of the bluff, not the sheer cliff face that formed the western wall of the valley, but a more gradual slope on the northern exposure where the terrain was less severe. It was still steep enough to be challenging, but with careful work and strategic switchbacks, she created a path that a determined cow could climb. Daisy was not enthusiastic about the journey. She stopped every few feet to express her displeasure, her lowing echoing off the rock walls like the complaints of a creature convinced it was being led to its doom. But eventually, with Emmett pulling on a rope and Lorena pushing from behind, they got her to the top. The first time Lorena collected a warm egg from the nesting box she had built against the cliff face, she held it in her palm as if it were a jewel. The first time one of the goats gave birth, producing a tiny bleeding kid with wobbly legs and enormous eyes, she felt a surge of fierce protective joy that she had not experienced since Josiah's death. Their cliff was no longer just a construction site. It was a farm, a homestead, a self-sufficient outpost suspended between earth and sky. It was alive. The summer that followed was different from any summer in living memory. The rain did not come. At first, no one paid much attention. Dry spells happened. Everyone knew that. The old-timers could remember years when the spring rains arrived late, when the summer monsoons were weaker than usual, when the creek ran low enough to expose rocks that normally lay hidden beneath the water. This was just another dry spell. Nothing to worry about. June passed without a drop of moisture falling from the sky. The sun rose each morning into a dome of pale, burnished brass, and it set each evening, leaving the land no cooler and no wetter than before. The creek shrank from a river to a stream, from a stream to a trickle, from a trickle to a string of stagnant pools connected by damp mud. July brought no relief. The heat intensified, hammering down on the valley like a physical weight. The air shimmered and danced above the fields, creating mirages of water that dissolved into nothing when you tried to approach them. Crops that should have been tall and green by now were stunted and yellow, their leaves curling inward to conserve moisture that was not there. August arrived, and still the sky remained clear. Cornelius Ashford, standing on the porch of his general store, continued to insist that the drought would break any day now. He had said the same thing in June. He had said it in July. By August, even his most loyal followers were beginning to doubt him. "The wells are running low," one of the farmers reported at a town meeting. "My deepest well is down to mud. I have to dig deeper just to get enough water for my family, let alone my animals." Others echoed the concern. Wells that had never failed in 20 years were producing only a fraction of their normal output. The creek, which had supplied water for gardens and livestock throughout the valley, was now completely dry in places. The ponds where cattle had always drunk their fill had shrunk to muddy depressions that stank of decay. "It will rain," Ashford insisted, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "It always rains eventually. We just need to be patient." But patience was becoming a luxury that the people of Redemption could not afford. Up on the cliff, Lorena watched the suffering below with a mixture of sorrow and grim satisfaction. Sorrow because she was not heartless. These were people she had known her whole life, people who had christened her and taught her in Sunday school and attended her wedding. The fact that they had mocked her and dismissed her did not mean she wished them ill, but satisfaction too, because she had been right. Her grandfather had been right. The signs they had ignored, the warnings they had dismissed, were now proving terrifyingly accurate. And while the valley withered, her gardens thrived. The cliff face provided natural shade during the hottest part of the day, protecting her plants from the brutal afternoon sun. The thermal mass of the rock kept the temperature more moderate than it was in the exposed valley below. And most importantly, the spring she had discovered deep in the back of her cold storage cavern continued its slow, steady flow. The mountain's lifeblood, pure and cold, and apparently inexhaustible, fed by underground sources that the drought had not yet reached. Lorena channeled this precious water with meticulous care. She carved tiny runnels in the rock, creating a network of irrigation channels that carried moisture to every plant on her terraces. Not a drop was wasted. Not a drop was allowed to evaporate in the sun when it could be soaking into the soil where roots could find it. Her kale grew dark and robust, the leaves thick and healthy. Her potato vines were lush and green, spreading across the soil with determined vigor. Her beans climbed the cliff face as if racing each other toward the sky, their tendrils finding purchase in every crack and crevice. From the valley floor, on the rare occasions when someone looked up at Sentinel's Bluff, the green terraces stood out against the brown and gray of the surrounding rock like emerald jewels set in a crown of stone. It should have been impossible. It was impossible by any normal reckoning. And yet, there it was. Lorena did not rest on her success. She knew that what they had accomplished so far was only the beginning, that the true test was still to come. She began to preserve everything. Every bean that ripened on the vine was picked and shelled and laid out to dry on flat rocks in the sun. Every excess cabbage was chopped and salted and packed into crocks to ferment into sauerkraut that would last through the winter. Every bucket of milk that Daisy produced beyond their immediate needs was churned into butter or made into hard cheese that could be waxed and stored for months. The cold storage cavern filled slowly with provisions: dried beans in cloth sacks, wheels of cheese coated in beeswax, crocks of pickled vegetables, smoked meat from a goat that had injured its leg and had to be slaughtered, sacks of potatoes buried in sand to keep them fresh and firm. Emmett watched his sister's feverish preparations with growing unease. "Why so much?" he asked one evening, as they sat by the fire eating their modest supper. "There are only two of us. We do not need enough food for an army." Lorena looked at him for a long moment, weighing how much to tell him. He was young, and the weight of what she knew might crush him if she was not careful. "Do you remember grandfather's stories?" she finally asked. "About the great droughts of the past?" Emmett nodded slowly. He remembered. Tales of rivers running dry and crops failing, and people starving in the midst of plenty because they had not thought to prepare for lean times. This is one of those droughts, Lorena said. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. This is not just a dry spell. This is the kind of drought that changes everything. And when it gets bad enough, when people start to truly suffer, they will come to us. Emmett stared at her. You think people will come here for help? I think people will come here because we have water and food and they do not. Whether they come asking politely or demanding forcefully remains to be seen. The thought had not occurred to Emmett. He had been so focused on their own survival, on the daily labor of building and planting and harvesting, that he had not considered what would happen when the larger world finally noticed what they had accomplished. Now he did consider it, and what he saw in his imagination made his blood run cold. A mob of starving people climbing up the cliff, desperate men with desperate intentions. Everything they had worked for, everything they had built, being torn apart by those who had mocked them. What do we do? He asked. We prepare, Lorena replied, and we hope that when the time comes, we can find a way to help them without destroying ourselves. The first frost of autumn arrived early that year, driven by clear skies that let the heat of the day escape into space without the blanket of clouds that normally held it close to the earth. In the valley below, the frost was a killing blow. What little remained of the failed crops was destroyed overnight. Gardens that people had been nursing, along with carefully rationed water, hoping to squeeze one last harvest from the drought-stricken soil, turned black and shriveled by morning. Winter was coming and redemption was not ready. The town had always been largely self-sufficient. Gardens and farms produced most of the food people needed, supplemented by hunting and by occasional purchases from Ashford's general store. The store itself was supplied by freight wagons that came through every few weeks bringing goods from larger towns to the east. But the freight wagons were becoming less frequent. The drought that was devastating redemption was also affecting the territories around it. There was less to buy, and what was available cost more. Ashford's shelves, once crowded with sacks of flour and sugar and coffee, were growing bare. Prices rose, first slowly then dramatically. A sack of flour that had cost $2 in spring now cost $5, then $8, then $10. Sugar became a luxury, coffee became a memory. Salt, which had once been cheap enough that nobody thought twice about using it, was suddenly precious. The people of redemption began to feel the pinch. Families that had lived comfortably for years found themselves making difficult choices. Meat or flour, medicine or fuel, feed for the animals or food for the children. The animals began to die, first the weakest ones. Cattle that had been struggling with the heat and the shortage of water simply gave up and lay down and did not get up again. Their carcasses dotted the dried-up pastures too numerous to bury, eventually picked clean by vultures and coyotes and left as bleached bones baking in the sun. Then the stronger ones, horses that had worked the fields for years, milk cows that had sustained families through hard times before, hogs that had been destined for winter slaughter but starved before they could be butchered. The people who had laughed at Lorena Whitfield for climbing a cliff and playing at pioneering began to look at their empty barns and their dying livestock and wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were the ones who had made a mistake. Winter came early and hard, not the gentle winter that the valley sometimes experienced with light snows and moderate cold and plenty of sunny days to break up the monotony. This was a brutal winter, a punishing winter, a winter that seemed determined to finish what the drought had started. The cold settled into the valley like an occupying army, establishing itself in every corner and refusing to leave. The ground froze solid to a depth of several feet, making it impossible to dig wells deeper or to bury the dead properly. The creek, which had been reduced to scattered pools during the drought, now froze over completely, its remaining water locked away beneath inches of ice. And still no snow fell. That was the cruelest irony. A winter without snow meant a spring without snow melt. The drought would continue into the next year and the next until something fundamental changed. Lorena understood this. understood that the suffering she could see from her clifftop home was only the beginning, that the worst was yet to come. Inside her carved stone rooms, she and Emmett lived in relative comfort. The massive walls of rock moderated the temperature, keeping them cool in summer and warm in winter. Their fire burned steadily, and the hearth she had designed, the smoke drawing up the angled chimney and disappearing into the sky. Their stores of food were ample, carefully rationed, but sufficient. But even from the safety of her mountain fortress, Lorena could not escape the knowledge of what was happening below. The smoke had stopped rising from most of the chimneys in town. At first, she thought people were conserving fuel, letting their fires burn low to make their wood supplies last longer. Then she realized the truth. They were burning everything they could find: fences and furniture and floorboards, anything that would produce heat, no matter how briefly. Some houses had already been stripped of anything combustible, their inhabitants huddling in corners, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, waiting for a warmth that never came. The merchant's wife died first. She had been ill for years, and the combination of cold and hunger finished what disease had started. They buried her in a shallow grave, hacked from the frozen ground, and the whole town turned out for the funeral, not out of respect for the deceased, but because standing close together was warmer than staying alone. Then old Mr. Peterson, who had run the livery stable until there were no more horses left to stable. Then the Williams infant, born too soon and too weak to survive in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. Then others, one by one, as the weeks of winter ground on. The town of Redemption was dying, and the people who remained alive began to look up at Sentinel's Bluff, at the smoke that still rose steadily from the cliff face, at the impossible green of terraces that should have been brown and dead like everything else. They began to wonder if salvation might come from the last place they had ever expected to find it. The knock came on a night so cold that the stars seemed to crackle in the clear black sky. Lorena had been sitting by the fire mending a shirt by lamplight when she heard it. Not a loud knock, not an insistent pounding, but a hesitant, desperate sound. The knock of someone who was not sure they had the right to ask for help, but had run out of other options. Emmett looked up from the harness he had been repairing. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against the wall nearby. Lorena shook her head slightly. "Wait," the gesture said. "Let me see who it is first." She crossed to the entrance of their home, a heavy wooden door that Emmett had built from salvaged timber and hung in a frame carved from the rock itself. She had not lit the exterior lantern tonight, conserving oil, so she could not see who was on the other side. "Who is there?" she called through the door. The voice that answered was thin and ragged, barely audible above the wind that howled across the cliff face. "Please." It was a woman's voice. "Please, I have nowhere else to go. My daughter is sick. She is dying." Lorena lifted the heavy bar that secured the door and pulled it open. Orly Kincaid stood on the narrow ledge outside her body, hunched against the cold. In her arms, she carried a bundle of rags that moved slightly, that emitted a weak, feverish whimper. Her daughter, maybe 5 years old, wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing her mother had been able to find, and still shivering with a cold that came from within as much as without. Lorena remembered Aurelie from the days after Josiah's funeral, remembered the casserole dish and the tears and the offer of a spare room in exchange for laundry services. Remembered the pity in her eyes, the condescension hidden beneath a veneer of kindness. She remembered, and for a moment she felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. "You came to offer me a place as your servant," she thought, "and now you stand at my door begging for scraps." But the moment passed quickly. The child in Orly's arms moaned again, and Lorena saw the terror in the mother's eyes. The desperate animal terror of a parent watching her offspring slip away and being powerless to stop it. "Come in," Lorena said, stepping aside. Orly stumbled through the doorway, her legs barely able to carry her. She had walked up the cliff path in the dark and the cold, carrying her sick child the entire way. It was a miracle she had made it at all. Emmett was already moving, pulling their one chair closer to the fire, helping Orly lower herself into it without dropping her precious burden. Lorena went to the cold storage cavern and returned with a small pot of broth that she had made the day before. She heated it over the fire while Orly rocked her daughter and wept. She has not kept anything down in 2 days. Orly said, the words coming out in a rush. The fever started 3 days ago and just keeps getting worse. The doctor came, but he has no medicine left. He has nothing. Nobody has anything anymore. Lorena ladled the warm broth into a cup and brought it to Orly. Let her sip this slowly, she said, just a little at a time. Her stomach needs to remember how to accept food. Orly looked at the cup of broth as if it were filled with liquid gold. In a way it was. The ingredients that had gone into it, the chicken bones and vegetables and careful seasoning, were worth more than money in a town where people were starving. She lifted the cup to her daughter's lips and coaxed her to drink. A sip, then another. The child swallowed weakly and the broth stayed down. Orly began to cry again, but these were different tears. Relief, not despair. I do not know how to thank you, she whispered. After everything, after the way we treated you, after what we said, I do not deserve this kindness. Lorena watched the child drink, watched the color slowly returning to cheeks that had been gray with approaching death. No, she said quietly, you do not. Orly flinched as if she had been struck. But this is not about deserving, Lorena continued. This is about what kind of person I want to be, what kind of world I want to live in. You have a sick child, I have food. The rest does not matter right now. She went back to the cold storage and returned with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Potatoes, she said, pressing it into Orly's free hand. And cheese, when she is well enough to eat solid food, start with these. Come back tomorrow and I will give you more. Orly stared at her, unable to speak. The woman who had once looked at Lorena with pity now looked at her with something entirely different, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Word of the cup of broth spread through the starving town like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in Redemption knew that Orly Kincaid had climbed up to the Cliff Witch's home and had come back down with food for her dying daughter. They knew that the child was recovering, that color was returning to her cheeks, that she had slept through the night without fever for the first time in days. They knew that there was food on the cliff, real food, enough to share. 3 more families made the trek up the cliff path that day. Thin, hollow-eyed people with hungry children and desperate hopes. They stood at the base of the cliff and called up their voices weak and pleading, and Lorena lowered baskets of provisions down to them on a rope. Potatoes, dried beans, hard cheese, small quantities carefully measured but infinitely precious to people who had been living on boiled roots and the occasional scrawny rabbit. The next day, 10 families came. Lorena and Emmett worked from dawn until dark, preparing bundles of food and lowering them down. The stores that Lorena had accumulated so carefully were diminishing at an alarming rate. At this pace, they would be empty within weeks. We cannot keep this up, Emmett said that night, his voice tight with worry. There are too many of them and not enough of us. If we give everything away, we will starve along with the rest of them. Lorena nodded slowly. She had been doing the calculations in her head all day, watching her carefully accumulated reserves shrink with each basket that went down the cliff. I know, she said. We need another way. She was still thinking about it, still turning the problem over in her mind when the delegation arrived. It was not a mob. Lorena had been half expecting a mob, a crowd of desperate people who had decided to take what they needed rather than beg for it. She had been preparing for violence, had positioned herself and Emmett at defensible points with their rifles within reach. But the group that climbed up to her ledge on that gray winter morning was something different, something that surprised her. 4 men, Cornelius Ashford at their head, his once portly frame now gaunt and hollow, his expensive clothes hanging loose on a body that had lost 40 pounds since the summer. Behind him came the Reverend Meacham and 2 of the town's council members. They climbed slowly, their weakness evident in every step. Ashford, who had once moved with the confident swagger of a successful merchant, now shuffled like an old man. His breath came in ragged gasps by the time he reached the ledge. Lorena stood at the entrance to her home and watch them come. She did not invite them in, did not offer them water or a place to rest. She simply stood and waited for them to speak. It was Ashford who spoke first, the man who had called her mad, the man who had predicted her failure with such confidence, the man who had charged her for lumber and tools and never missed an opportunity to remind her of her place in the world. His voice, when it came, was stripped of its usual bluster. It was the voice of a broken man, a humiliated man, a man who had finally been forced to confront the limits of his own understanding. "We were wrong," he said. The words seemed to cost him physical pain. "We were fools. Our people are starving. We are asking for your help." Lorena looked at him for a long moment, looked at the man who had laughed at her, who had called her the cliff witch, who had whispered behind her back and predicted her downfall with such relish. She felt the satisfaction she had expected to feel, the vindication, the triumph of being proven right when everyone else had been proven wrong. But she also felt something else, something deeper and more complicated: pity. Not the condescending pity that Ashford and the others had once shown at her. Not the pity that comes from looking down at someone less fortunate. This was the pity that comes from looking at another human being and seeing their suffering clearly without judgment or reservation. Cornelius Ashford was a flawed man, a small man in many ways, but he was also a man who had swallowed his pride and climbed a cliff to beg for help from someone he had wronged. That took a kind of courage, even if it was courage born of desperation. Lorena made her decision. "I will not give you handouts," she said, her voice firm and clear. "Charity will last a week. Survival has to be earned. It has to be learned." The men looked at each other, confusion mixing with the hope in their eyes. "What are you suggesting?" the Reverend asked. Lorena stepped forward and looked down at the valley below, at the dead fields and the empty streets in the town that had once been her home. "I will provide food for everyone who is willing to work," she said. "The work will be for our collective future. We will dig a cistern at the base of the cliff to catch every drop of water when the rains finally return. We will carve more terraces. We will build a better path for the animals so we can expand the herd. You will bring me every seed you have left in the town. You will bring me tools and lumber and salt." She turned back to face them, and her eyes were hard with determination. "I will feed you," she continued, "and in return you will help me save us all." Ashford stared at her. The other men stared at her. For a long moment no one spoke. Then slowly Cornelius Ashford bowed his head. "We accept your terms," he said, and with those words, everything changed. The transformation of redemption began the next morning. They came in groups at first, families with children, elderly couples, young men with strong backs and empty bellies. They gathered at the base of Sentinel's Bluff and looked up at the cliff that had always marked the edge of their world, and they prepared to climb. Lorena met them at the top. She had spent the night organizing, planning, turning the vague outline of an idea into a concrete program of action. She had lists of tasks and assignments and schedules. She had a system. The first priority was the cistern. Water was the foundation of everything. Without water, the gardens could not grow. The animals could not survive. The people could not live. When the rains finally came, whenever that might be, they needed to be ready to capture every drop. The men went to work with picks and shovels, digging into the rocky soil at the base of the cliff. It was a brutal labor, especially for bodies weakened by months of hunger. But Lorena fed them. Simple food, basic food, but enough to give them the energy they needed to work. And work they did. The hole grew deeper day by day. Feet became yards, became dozens of yards. The stone and soil they excavated was not wasted. Lorena directed them to pile it in specific locations, creating the foundations for new terrace walls that would expand her growing operation. Meanwhile, the women organized a communal kitchen at the base of the cliff. They cooked the rations that Lorena provided, stretching each ingredient as far as it could go. They made soups and stews that could feed dozens with ingredients that would normally serve only a handful. They remembered skills that their grandmothers had known, techniques for surviving hard times that had been almost forgotten in the years of plenty. The children, too weak to work but too many to ignore, were gathered in a sheltered alcove near the cliff face. The older women watched over them while their parents labored. They told stories and sang songs and did their best to keep young minds occupied while young bodies recovered from the ravages of hunger. And through it all, Lorena moved among them like a general directing a campaign. She taught them what her grandfather had taught her: how to read the rock, how to terrace land to prevent erosion, how to conserve water through careful channeling and mulching. She was demanding but fair, pushing them to work harder than they had ever worked, while also ensuring that no one was pushed beyond their limits. Cornelius Ashford, the man who had mocked her most loudly and most often, became her most diligent student. He worked the winch that hauled soil up the cliff, faces soft merchants, hands blistering and then bleeding, and then slowly developing the calluses of honest labor. He hauled stone for the terrace walls until his back screamed for relief, and then he hauled more. At night, when the work was done and the people gathered around fires at the base of the cliff, he would approach Lorena with questions. How did you know the drought was coming? How did you learn to read the rock? Where did your grandfather get his knowledge? She answered him honestly, without condescension or gloating. She told him about Ezekiel Pardo's years of study, about the books and the observations and the patterns that became visible only to those who knew how to look for them. We thought he was crazy, Ashford admitted one night, his voice heavy with regret. We thought he was just a strange old man talking to rocks. We never considered that he might be right about anything. Most people do not think in geological time, Lorena replied. They think in seasons, in years, maybe in decades if they are particularly far-sighted. But the Earth thinks in centuries and millennia. The patterns that govern our lives are invisible on a human scale. You have to learn to see differently. Ashford was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Can it be learned, he finally asked. This different way of seeing Lorena looked at him, at the man he had been full of pride and certainty, and at the man he was becoming, humbled and hungry for understanding. Yes, she said, it can be learned, but it requires something that most people find difficult. What? Admitting that you do not already know everything. Ashford laughed, a short, bitter sound. I think we have all learned that lesson, he said, whether we wanted to or not. The weeks passed, the work continued, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the relationship between the town and the cliff began to change. At first, the people of Redemption saw Lorena as their savior, but also as their judge. They came to her for food with their heads bowed, ashamed of their need and resentful of their dependence. They worked under her direction because they had no choice, not because they believed in what they were building. But as the cistern took shape, as the new terraces rose along the cliff face, as the path to the clifftop widened and improved, something shifted in the collective consciousness of the town. They began to see themselves not as charity cases, but as partners in a shared enterprise. They began to take pride in the work of their hands, in the calluses, in the sore muscles, in the visible evidence of their effort. They began to believe that they might actually survive. Gideon Falk, the blacksmith, who had been the first to believe in Lorena's vision, worked day and night to keep the tools sharp and the equipment functional. His forge, which had been cold and silent for months, now glowed with fire again, the sound of his hammer ringing across the valley like a heartbeat. He made new tools to replace the ones that broke under heavy use. He repaired the winch mechanism when it began to show signs of wear. He fashioned brackets and hinges and hardware for the expanding operation on the cliff. And he watched Lorena with eyes that held something more than professional respect. She saw it, of course. Saw the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. Saw the care he put into every tool he made for her, the extra attention to detail that went beyond mere craftsmanship. She was not ready to think about such things. Not yet. The wound of Josiah's death was still too fresh, the demands of survival too pressing. But she filed the observation away, a possibility to be considered when there was time for possibilities. For now, there was only the work. Spring came late that year, creeping into the valley on hesitant feet, as if uncertain of its welcome. The sky remained clear. The rain did not come, but the days grew longer and warmer, and the brutal cold of winter slowly released its grip on the land. In the valley below, the scars of the disaster were everywhere visible. Abandoned houses with broken windows, fields that had reverted to weeds and scrub. The carcasses of animals reduced now to scattered bones that gleamed white in the spring sunshine. But at the base of Sentinel's Bluff, something remarkable had taken shape. The cistern was finished, a massive excavation lined with carefully fitted stone, capable of holding tens of thousands of gallons of water when the rains finally came. Channels had been dug to direct runoff from the cliff face into the reservoir. A system of gates and valves fashioned by Gideon Falk from scavenged metal would allow the water to be distributed as needed. Above the cistern, the new terraces rose in neat steps up the cliff face. Soil had been hauled and spread and enriched with compost from the communal gardens. Seeds had been planted, precious seeds that Lorena had held back from her own stores and that the townspeople had contributed from their dwindling supplies. The path to the cliff top had been widened and improved with sturdy railings and cut steps that made the climb safer and easier. More animals had been brought up. More gardens had been established. The people of Redemption had built something together, something that belonged to all of them, something that represented not just survival, but hope for the future. And then one evening in late spring, the clouds appeared. They came from the west, rolling over the mountains like a great gray wave. For months the sky had been empty, a vast dome of burnished brass that seemed to mock the suffering below. Now suddenly it was full of clouds, full of moisture, full of promise. The first drops fell just before sunset, big fat drops that splattered on the dry ground and raised puffs of dust before being absorbed by the thirsty earth. Then more drops, then more. Then a steady rain that built and built until it was falling in sheets, in torrents, in a deluge that seemed determined to make up for all the months of absence in a single night. The people of Redemption stood in the rain and lifted their faces to the sky and wept. They wept with relief and joy and gratitude. They wept for the suffering they had endured and for the miracle they had been granted. They wept because they were alive against all odds and because the world had finally remembered to be kind. And up on the cliff, Lorena Whitfield stood at the entrance to her home and watched the water pour into the cistern below. Watched the channel she had designed carrying the precious liquid exactly where it needed to go. Watched everything she had planned and worked for finally coming together. The earth remembers, she whispered into the rain. And now so will we. The rain fell for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping. It came down in sheets and curtains and walls of water, transforming the dry creek bed into a roaring torrent, turning the dusty streets of Redemption into rivers of mud, filling every depression and hollow in the land with precious life-giving moisture. The people who had spent months praying for rain now found themselves praying for it to stop. The ground, baked hard by months of drought, could not absorb water fast enough. It ran off in streams and rivulets, carrying topsoil with it, threatening to undo in days what nature had built over centuries. But at the base of Sentinel's Bluff, the system that Lorena had designed held firm. The terraces she had built caught the water as it cascaded down the cliff face, slowing its descent, allowing it to soak into the soil rather than scouring it away. The channel she had carved directed the overflow into the great cistern below, where it collected in an ever-deepening pool of brown, muddy, beautiful water. By the time the rain finally stopped, the cistern was nearly full. Thousands upon thousands of gallons, enough to sustain the gardens and animals through another dry spell, enough to provide security against whatever the sky might decide to do next. Lorena stood at the edge of the cistern on the morning after the rain ended and looked down at her reflection in the still water. Behind her, the sun rose over the eastern mountains, painting the wet rocks in shades of gold and amber. She was 20 years old, a widow, a builder, a leader of people who had once dismissed her as mad. She did not feel 20. She felt ancient, worn down to bedrock by the weight of everything she had endured and accomplished. But she also felt something else, something she had almost forgotten existed. Peace, not the peace of rest or relaxation, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing you have done what needed to be done. That you have faced the worst the world could throw at you and emerged not just surviving, but stronger. The earth remembers, her grandfather had written. And because she had listened, because she had learned to read its memories and work with its rhythms, her people would survive. They would more than survive. They would thrive. The weeks that followed the rain were a frenzy of activity. Seeds that had been hoarded through the long winter were now planted in the softened earth. Every terrace on the cliff face became a garden, every patch of level ground a potential source of food. The people of redemption who had learned through bitter experience the cost of complacency threw themselves into the work with desperate energy. They planted corn and wheat and barley in the valley, fields crops that had failed so spectacularly the year before. But this time they did it differently. Following Lorena's instructions, they contoured the land to prevent erosion, dug irrigation channels fed by the cistern, created windbreaks and shade structures to protect tender seedlings from the harsh Arizona sun. They planted vegetables on the terraces, taking advantage of the thermal mass of the cliff and the careful irrigation system that Lorena had designed. They expanded the orcharding on the clifftop, adding more fruit trees and berry bushes that would provide food for years to come. And they worked on the infrastructure that would sustain them through future crises. More cisterns were dug, smaller ones scattered throughout the valley to capture runoff from local hills. Root cellars were excavated, cool underground spaces where vegetables could be stored through the hottest months. Smokehouses were built for preserving meat, and drying racks were constructed for fruits and vegetables. The town of Redemption was being rebuilt from the foundation up. Not just the physical structures, though those were being repaired and improved as well. The entire philosophy of the community was changing, shifting from the blind optimism that had nearly destroyed them to a more cautious, prepared approach to life. Lorena was at the center of it all. She taught and supervised and planned and directed, drawing on the knowledge her grandfather had accumulated and the practical experience she had gained through her own struggles. She was everywhere at once, it seemed, answering questions and solving problems and pushing people to work harder and smarter than they ever had before. But she was careful not to make herself indispensable. Every skill she possessed, she taught to others. Every technique she had developed, she shared freely. She knew that true resilience could not depend on any single person, no matter how capable. The community had to be able to sustain itself even if she were no longer there to guide it. So, Cornelius Ashford proved to be an unexpectedly apt pupil. The merchant who had once dismissed Lorena as mad now followed her with the devotion of a convert. He asked endless questions, took careful notes, practiced the techniques she taught until he could perform them as well as she could. His transformation was remarkable to witness. The arrogant, self-satisfied businessman had been stripped away layer by layer, revealing something unexpected beneath. A genuine curiosity about how the world worked. A willingness to admit ignorance and learn from those who knew more. A capacity for hard work that his soft merchant's life had never required him to develop. One evening, as the sun set over the valley and the workers gathered for their communal meal, Ashford approached Lorena, where she sat alone on a rock outcropping, looking out over the land. "May I join you?" he asked. Lorena nodded, and he lowered himself onto a nearby boulder with a grunt of effort. His body, though still lean from the months of hunger, was stronger than it had ever been. Muscles he had never known he possessed now showed beneath skin that had been weathered by sun and wind. They sat in silence for a while, watching the colors change in the sky. Then Ashford spoke. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "about what you said that night when we came to ask for your help. Which part, the part about survival needing to be earned? about charity only lasting a week. Lorena turned to look at him, curious where this was going. I did not understand it at the time, Ashford continued. I thought you were being cruel, making us grovel for what you could have given freely. But I understand now. What do you understand? He gestured at the valley below, at the people working in the fields and the gardens, growing on the terraces and the cisterns filling with water. If you had simply given us food, we would have eaten it and then starved again when it ran out. We would have learned nothing, changed nothing. We would still be the same fools who laughed at you and called you mad. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But you made us work for it, he said. You made us build something together. And in the building, we became different people. People who understand that the earth has rules and that we ignore those rules at our peril. Lorena nodded slowly. It was perhaps the most perceptive thing she had ever heard Cornelius Ashford say. My grandfather tried to teach these lessons for years, she said. No one listened. Ashford's face twisted with something that might have been shame. We were fools, he said simply. I was the biggest fool of all. I made jokes about him behind his back, called him a crazy old man who talked to rocks. He turned to face her directly, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I am sorry, he said. Not just for what I said about you, though. God knows I am sorry for that, too. I am sorry for what we did to him, for dismissing his wisdom and ignoring his warnings. If we had listened, if we had prepared as he urged us to, so many people might still be alive. Lorena felt something shift inside her, a knot of anger and resentment that she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. He would not have wanted your apology, she said. He would have wanted you to learn, to change, to pass on what you have learned to others so that the same mistakes are not repeated. Ashford nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Then that is what I will do, he said. For whatever years I have left, I will teach what you have taught me. I will make sure this town never forgets. The first harvest came in late summer, and it exceeded everyone's expectations. The corn grew tall and strong, the ears heavy with golden kernels. The wheat ripened to a rich amber, bending gracefully under the weight of its seeds. The vegetables on the terraces produced abundantly, nourished by the careful irrigation and the rich soil that had been built up over months of composting and cultivation. But it was not just the quantity that amazed people. It was the quality. The vegetables were larger and more flavorful than anything they had grown before. The grain was plump and full, with none of the shriveled, drought-stressed kernels that had characterized their harvests in years past. Even the fruit trees, though still too young to bear a full crop, produced a handful of apples and peaches that were sweeter and juicier than any the old-timers could remember. The difference was the system. The terraces and cisterns and irrigation channels that Lorena had designed did more than just capture and distribute water. They created a microclimate, a protected environment where plants could thrive, even when conditions in the surrounding area were harsh. The cliff face itself played a role. Its massive bulk absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, moderating temperature extremes. Its overhanging portions provided shade during the hottest hours, protecting delicate seedlings from the brutal afternoon sun. Its natural drainage patterns directed water to where it was needed most. Lorena's grandfather had understood all of this. He had seen the potential in what everyone else dismissed as a worthless piece of rock. He had spent years studying and documenting, preparing for a future he would never live to see. And now his granddaughter was bringing that future to life. The Harvest Festival that year was unlike anything Redemption had ever experienced. In the past, such celebrations had been modest affairs. A few speeches, a communal meal, perhaps some music and dancing if people were in the mood. The focus had always been on giving thanks to Guri for the bounty of the earth, with little attention paid to the human effort that had made the bounty possible. This year was different. The entire town gathered at the base of Sentinel's Bluff in the cleared area that had become the de facto center of the community. Tables were set up in long rows laden with the fruits of their collective labor, corn and wheat and vegetables of every description. Bread baked from flour ground on the new mill that Gideon Falk had built. Cheese and butter from the dairy animals that had multiplied on the cliff top. Meat from the livestock that had thrived on the improved pastures. It was a feast. A genuine feast, the first that any of them had experienced in nearly 2 years. And as they gathered around the tables and looked at the abundance before them, many found themselves weeping with gratitude. The Reverend Josiah Meacham offered a prayer of thanksgiving, his voice breaking with emotion as he spoke of deliverance from darkness in the mysterious ways of providence. But when he finished, he did something unprecedented. He called Lorena forward. She came reluctantly, uncomfortable with being singled out. She had never sought recognition or praise. She had simply done what needed to be done, what her grandfather had prepared her to do. But the people of redemption needed this moment. They needed to acknowledge what had happened, to give voice to the transformation they had undergone. This woman, the Reverend said, gesturing to Lorena, saved us. Not through magic or miracles, but through wisdom and foresight and backbreaking work. She saw what we could not see. She prepared for what we refused to imagine. And when we finally came to her starving and desperate, she did not turn us away. He paused, looking out at the crowd. We called her mad, he continued, his voice heavy with shame. We called her the Cliff Witch. We mocked her and pitied her and predicted her failure. And she answered our cruelty with mercy. She fed us when we were hungry. She taught us when we were ignorant. She led us when we had lost our way. He turned to face Lorena directly. We owe you a debt we can never repay, he said, but we can start by asking your forgiveness for the names we called you, for the doubt we showed you, for all the ways we failed to see what was right in front of us. Lorena looked out at the faces before her, faces she had known her whole life, faces that had once looked at her with pity and contempt and now looked at her with something very different: respect, gratitude, love. She thought of her grandfather, who had tried so hard to share his knowledge and been dismissed as a fool. She thought of Josiah, who had believed in her when no one else did. She thought of all the lonely months she had spent digging her home from the rock, sustained only by her own determination and the words of a dead man. She thought of all the anger she had carried, all the resentment, all the bitter satisfaction she had felt when the doubters were finally proven wrong. And she let it go. I do not need your forgiveness, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. I need your partnership. I need your commitment to building a community that can survive whatever challenges lie ahead. I need you to remember what we learned this past year and to teach those lessons to your children and your children's children. She paused, looking around at the crowd. My grandfather used to say that the earth remembers everything, she continued, but people forget. Our job now is to become people who remember, who learn from the past and prepare for the future, who work with the earth instead of against it. She raised her cup filled with water from the cistern they had built together. To remembering, she said, to remembering. The crowd echoed, raising their own cups. And in that moment, something was born. Not just gratitude or relief, but a new way of being. A community that had faced its own destruction and emerged transformed, committed to a different path. Gideon Falk found her later that evening, sitting alone on the ledge outside her cliff home, looking out at the valley below. The celebrations were still going on. Music and laughter drifted up from the base of the cliff, the sounds of a community rediscovering joy after a long season of suffering. But Lorena had slipped away, needing a moment of solitude to process everything that had happened. Mind if I join you? Gideon asked. She shook her head and he lowered himself onto the rock beside her. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. You spoke well tonight, Gideon finally said. People needed to hear those words. Lorena shrugged. I said what was true. That is what made it powerful. More silence, then Gideon spoke again, his voice softer now. I have been thinking about the future, he said. about what comes next. What do you mean? I mean, he said slowly, that I have spent my whole life making things. Tools and hardware and all the metal objects that people need to live. It is good work, honest work. But I never felt like I was building anything that would last. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his face was earnest and open. What you have done here, he continued, what you are doing, it will last for generations, maybe forever, and I want to be part of it. Lorena felt her heart quicken, though she tried not to show it. You are already part of it, she said. Your tools made this possible. Your forge kept us going when everything else failed. Gideon shook his head. That is not what I mean, he said, and I think you know it. Lorena was quiet for a long moment. She thought of Josiah, of the love they had shared, and the future that had been stolen from them. She thought of the grief that still lived in her heart, the wound that had never fully healed. But she also thought of the life stretching before her, the work that still needed to be done, the loneliness that came with carrying such heavy responsibilities. I am not ready, she said finally. Not yet. To her surprise, Gideon nodded. I know, he said, and I am not asking you to be. I am just telling you that when you are ready, I will be here. However long that takes. He stood up, brushing dust from his trousers. I am a patient man, he said. I work with fire and metal. I know that the best steel takes time to forge. Some things cannot be rushed. He started to walk away, then paused and looked back at her. But I also want you to know, he added, that I see you, not the cliff witch, not the savior of redemption. You, the woman who works harder than anyone I have ever met, who carries more weight than anyone should have to carry alone. I see you, Lorena Whitfield, and I think you are remarkable. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the stars and the distant sounds of celebration. The years that followed brought changes both gradual and profound. The town of Redemption grew and prospered. Families that had lost nearly everything rebuilt their homes and their lives. New families arrived, drawn by stories of the community that had survived the great drought through preparation and cooperation. The cliff face became a landmark famous throughout the territory. Travelers would detour miles out of their way just to see the terraced gardens rising up the rock wall, the ingenious irrigation systems, the homes carved from living stone. Some came to learn. Lorena welcomed them, teaching the principles of water conservation and soil management that her grandfather had developed and she had refined. Students arrived from agricultural colleges in the East, taking notes and asking questions, and marveling at what a 19-year-old widow had accomplished with nothing but determination and wisdom. Others came to settle. The reputation of Redemption as a community that knew how to survive hard times attracted pioneers looking for a place where their skills and labor would be valued. The population grew, and with it the network of cisterns and terraces expanded up and down the valley. Cornelius Ashford, true to his word, became the community's historian and educator. He compiled Ezekiel Pardo's notes into a book that was taught in the newly expanded school, ensuring that future generations would understand the principles that had saved their predecessors. He traveled to neighboring towns, spreading the knowledge and helping them prepare for droughts of their own. Emmett grew into a capable young man, taking over more and more of the daily management of the cliff operations. He had inherited his sister's determination and his grandfather's curiosity about the natural world. By the time he was 25, he was running the agricultural operations with quiet efficiency, freeing Lorena to focus on teaching and planning. And Gideon waited. He waited through the first year and the second. He waited while Lorena threw herself into her work, while she taught and planned and built. He was there when she needed help, absent when she needed solitude. He never pushed, never pressured, never made her feel obligated. He simply loved her patiently and steadfastly and trusted that she would come to him when she was ready. It took 3 years. The wedding was held at the entrance to the cliff home on a clear spring morning when the valley was green with new growth and the air was sweet with the scent of blossoming fruit trees. The entire town attended. Not just the old families who had survived the drought, but the newcomers as well. They filled the terraces in the cleared area at the base of the cliff, spilling out onto the path that led down to the valley. The Reverend Meacham performed the ceremony, his voice stronger now than it had been in the dark days of the famine. He spoke of love and partnership of two people who had found each other in the midst of hardship and built something beautiful together. Lorena wore a dress that had belonged to her mother, simple and white and trimmed with lace. Her hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, trembled slightly as Gideon slipped the ring onto her finger. A ring he had forged himself from silver found in a vein deep within the mountain. A ring that represented not just their union, but the union of fire and earth, of craft and nature, of two people who had learned to work with the world rather than against it. When the ceremony was complete and the couple was pronounced married, a cheer went up that echoed off the cliff face and rolled across the valley. People who had once called Lorena mad now celebrated her happiness. People who had once mocked her now wept with joy. The feast that followed lasted well into the night. There was music and dancing and laughter, the sounds of a community that had learned to celebrate life because it had come so close to losing everything. And when the celebration finally wound down, when the last guests had departed and the fires had burned low, Lorena and Gideon stood together at the entrance to their home and looked out at the world they had helped to build. Happy Gideon asked his arm around her shoulders. Lorena leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. Content, she said. For the first time in a very long time, I am content. The decades passed and Lorena Whitfield Falk became a legend. Not the kind of legend that is told in taverns and grows more exaggerated with each retelling. A quieter kind. The kind that is passed down in families from grandmother to mother to daughter. The kind that shapes the way a community thinks about itself and its place in the world. The cliff home expanded over the years. New rooms were carved, new passages connected. What had begun as a single chamber dug by a grieving widow became a complex of living spaces and workrooms and storage areas, all connected by corridors that wound through the heart of the mountain. Children were born there. Lorena and Gideon had two boys and a girl. They grew up running through stone hallways, playing on terraces that hung above the valley floor, learning from their earliest years that the earth was something to be respected and worked with, not conquered and exploited. Grandchildren followed, then great-grandchildren. Each generation added its own contributions to the legacy, expanding the terraces, improving the irrigation systems, finding new ways to work with the land. The town of Redemption became famous throughout the territory and eventually throughout the nation. Agricultural experts came to study its methods. Government officials came to learn how to prepare communities for drought and disaster. Journalists came to write stories about the remarkable woman who had carved a home from a cliff and saved a town from starvation. Lorena received them all with patience and grace. She told her story countless times, always emphasizing the same points: the importance of observation, the value of preparation, the wisdom of working with natural systems rather than against them. She never took sole credit for what had been accomplished. She always spoke of her grandfather, whose research had made everything possible. She spoke of Josiah, whose skills as a carpenter had helped her understand the principles of construction. She spoke of Emmett, who had stood by her when everyone else thought she was mad. She spoke of Gideon, whose tools and steadfast support had been essential to every stage of the work. And she spoke of the community itself, the people who had overcome their pride and learned to work together, the families who had contributed their labor and their seeds and their knowledge, the children who had grown up with a different understanding of what it meant to live on the land. It was never about me, she would say. It was about all of us learning to remember what we had forgotten, learning to listen to what the earth was trying to tell us. On a morning in late autumn, many decades after the Great Drought, an old woman sat on the stone porch of her cliff home and watched her great-grandchildren playing on the terraces below. Lorena Whitfield Falk was 93 years old. Her hair had long since turned white. Her skin was weathered by nearly a century of sun and wind, and her hands, once so strong and capable, now trembled with age. But her eyes were still clear, and her mind was still sharp enough to appreciate the view spread out before her. The Valley of Redemption was green and prosperous. Fields of grain rippled in the morning breeze. Orchards heavy with fruit dotted the landscape. The creek, which had once dried to a string of stagnant pools, now ran full and clear, fed by a network of cisterns and reservoirs that captured every drop of rainfall. The cliff face itself was transformed. Terraces rose in green steps from the valley floor to the cliff top, each one producing food for the community. The stone homes carved into the rock had multiplied housing families who had chosen to live as the Pardo and Whitfield generations had lived in partnership with the mountain. And everywhere she looked, Lorena saw the evidence of the principles she had spent her life teaching. Contoured fields that prevented erosion, windbreaks that protected crops from harsh weather, water management systems that turned every rainstorm into a resource rather than a disaster. The earth remembers, she thought, and now so do they. A small figure detached itself from the group of playing children and came running up the path toward her. Her youngest great-granddaughter, a girl of 7, with her grandmother's dark hair and her great-great-grandfather Ezekiel's curious eyes. Great-grandmother, the girl said, climbing up onto the porch and settling herself beside Lorena. Tell me the story again. Which story, little one? The story of how you built the house in the mountain. The story of the drought and the famine and how you saved everyone. Lorena smiled. She had told this story hundreds of times to children and grandchildren and journalists and officials. Each time she told it, she discovered something new, some detail she had forgotten, or some connection she had not previously seen. Very well, she said, but first bring me the box on the shelf by the window. The girl ran to fetch it, returning with a small wooden box that had been carved by Josiah Whitfield more than 70 years ago. Lorena opened it with trembling hands and removed a single object, a fossil, a small piece of shale with the imprint of an ancient sea creature preserved in its surface. The fossil that had belonged to her grandfather, that had inspired his lifelong study of the earth and its memories. She pressed it into her great-granddaughter's hand. This belonged to your great-great-great-grandfather Ezekiel, she said. He gave it to me when I was about your age. Do you know what it is? The girl examined it with the intensity of a born naturalist. It looks like a shell, she said, but it is made of rock. It is both, Lorena said. It was a shell once millions of years ago when this whole valley was covered by a great ocean. The creature that lived in it died, and over time the shell turned to stone. But it kept its shape. It remembered what it had been. She tapped the fossil with one gnarled finger. Your great-great-great-grandfathers used to say that the earth remembers everything, she continued. That if you learn to read its memories, it will teach you everything you need to know. That is what this fossil represents, the earth's memory, and it is what our family has dedicated itself to understanding and preserving. The girl turned the fossil over in her hands, her young face serious with concentration. Will you teach me, she asked. Teach me to read the earth's memories. Lorena felt tears prick at her eyes. Tears of joy and gratitude and the bittersweet knowledge that her time was growing short. Yes, she said, I will teach you everything I know. And when I am gone, you will teach others, and they will teach others after them. And the memory will never be lost. She looked out at the valley one more time at the community her struggle had helped to build, at the green and growing evidence that wisdom once learned could be passed down through generations. The earth remembers, she said, softly speaking now to herself as much as to her great-granddaughter. And because of what we have built here, because of what we have learned, our people will remember too. The little